Woody Kingman, who's an alumnus of the class of 1978. It's my pleasure to represent the Blake alumni community as your host at Breakfast at Blake this morning. This speaker series, presented by the Blake Office of Alumni Advancement, has become an institutional tradition over the last few years. We've been doing this now for 9 years. And we had a great slate this year. We're already working on a terrific slate for next year. So hope to see you with many more of them, including our last one of the year, which will be Breakfast at Blake, Head of School edition. We will be meeting on June 18th over at the Minnetonka Club with Ann Staffney to hear her report for State of the School. So I hope you'll all join us there on June 18th. Then we're going to take a few months off for the summertime, but I know that you want to commune with your fellow alumni and can't wait until we get going next September. So we're going to have the Greater Blake Open Golf event on July 27th. That'll be at the Deer Run Golf Club. There are notices and a lot of the communications, but hope that you'll register and play in the Greater Blake Open. Well, today our guest, John Wright, class of 1979, is going to talk to us about his experiences in Asia. But I think one of the most interesting things, now that he's moved back to the United States after 30 years over there, is how he got there in the first place. John was an anthropology major at Lewis and Clark, and he was studying Sanskrit and Hindi, and so he decided to go on location to improve his language skills and reading skills in these ancient languages. So he went and spent a year in the Himalayas, returned to Lewis and Clark, got his master's in journalism at the University of Missouri, and because of his interest in Asia, applied for it and was awarded a Fulbright scholarship to study for a year in India. But after just 3 weeks after arriving in New Delhi, Indira Gandhi was assassinated and he was immediately recalled to the United States, and so ended his Fulbright scholarship. But he landed on the doorstep of the Wall Street Journal, and they looked at his resume and said, well, this is a guy that understands the Far East and the Middle East. And so they sent him to Peshawar, Pakistan, to report on the Russian occupation of Afghanistan. And believe it or not, it really wasn't that newsworthy of an item. Boy, oh boy, have times changed, right? And so after just 4 months, as John said, either my articles were so boring or no one really cared about what was going on in Afghanistan back then. The Wall Street Journal relocated them to Hong Kong. So at the ripe age of 23, John was made the news editor for all of Asia with 30 Wall Street Journal reporters underneath him. He claims he felt so young and inexperienced that he grew a beard just to earn the respect of his staff. So, wearing a beard, and after a 30-year career in Hong Kong and crisscrossing all of Asia, he's learned a thing or two about that part of the world, and here to tell us about it, about the future of Asia, whether it's a myth or whether there's some reality to it, is Blake's own John Wright.
Thanks for that, Woody. I don't have to be very formal. You can be a little bit informal. How many of you have been to Asia? How many of you have been to Asia in the last 10 years? How many of you are Asian? So the last time I stood on this stage was 1972. Lots changed. I definitely am taller. I definitely am older. I became a grandfather this year. That's quite an amazing thing. I'm sure those of you who have grandchildren know how special that is, and it's very, very different. I'm enjoying it. I'm delighted to be back in the United States. Since I stood on the stage in 1972, I've had a pretty extraordinary life. I have been around the world. I lived in Hong Kong for 30 years. I ran the Wall Street Journal in Asia. I met Osama bin Laden. That was a pretty interesting meeting. I had an amazing time as editor of the Wall Street Journal throughout all of the 80s in Asia. And it was that time in Asia in which the growth for an amazing amount of change was set. If you remember back in 1980, there were only 3 countries in Asia that were democratic: Japan, Malaysia, and India. When I arrived on the doorstep of Wall Street Journal in 1984, wow, that's a long time ago, Asia was not even a second thought to most men and women of industry in America. It was very European focused. And slowly across time, everything began to change, and we began to write the Pacific Century. During that time, I really learned about globalization, and globalization was really driving forward very fast. And I learned that money bought freedom. And I think that was a pretty interesting lesson. And I saw it happen as each of the countries around Asia started to fall away from their dictatorships. And it was those dictatorships that really gave rise to a kind of new spirit of democracy. And it started in the Philippines in 1986, when Ferdinand Marcos fled. I think you remember that. And I stood on the steps of Malacanang Palace as a 25-year-old. And the Swarovski helicopters had all taken the Marcoses away and flew them to Hawaii, and people power went charging in to the palace of the dictator of the Philippines. And the people power movement began in earnest across Asia, and it moved pretty rapidly. Taiwan followed very quickly, if you remember this time. In September of 1986, the Philippines fell in February. The son of Chiang Kai-shek, who had been the leader of Taiwan, who had fled to Taiwan, had a son who was running the country and identified a local indigenous Taiwanese named Li Tenghui to run for government, and Taiwan became democratic. In South Korea, 1987, so a year later, South Korea ended martial law, and No Tae-woo became president. I can remember the labor protests on the shipyards in South Korea that we were covering at the time. And it was just amazing to kind of feel this entire movement of democracy sort of begin to spread across all of Asia. Thailand was next in 1988. Burma followed that same year. If we can I change this to the map that I have? Can you all see this? So, we had here Japan, democratic, pretty much run by the United States. India, very staunchly independent, democratic, and Malaysia. And suddenly now, We're starting here with the Philippines, Taiwan, Korea. Remember that Russia controls Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. Thailand goes democratic, Burma follows, goes democratic, and Indonesia begins the process of going democratic. And suddenly, like the Middle East today, this sweeping democracy goes all across the region. And then we come to China, 1989. In May of 1989, Hu Yaobang died. Hu Yaobang was considered the biggest proponent of democracy in China and inspired a lot of students across the entire country. When he died, the students took to Tiananmen Square. You remember that? And occupied Tiananmen Square for an entire month. I was in that square many times that year and watched the entire democratic movement gain speed and move forward quicker than the Chinese authorities could ever even imagine or want to imagine. And right about at that time, just 3 weeks into the protests, something happened in another part of the world. And that was that the parliament in East Germany was lost to the communists. And it was very apparent then that Germany was unsustainable. And so all the support that Japan had been pouring into democracy across Asia, remember Japan had revalued its currency just at this time in 1985, and in the Plaza Accord in New York that May of 1985, the yen was moved from 350 to the US dollar to 150 to the US dollar. James Baker had concocted this plan and put the whole thing together with everybody's support, basically to rescue the American auto industry. Ironically, the auto industry still needed to be rescued several decades later. But Japan was moving all of its production into cheap labor spots. So it had really taken over a lot of Thailand and was driving what was going on in Burma, a lot of Indonesia, the Philippines. It was all being run by production from Japan. Asia was democratic until June 4th, 1989, when one man stood in front of 4 tanks and it was broadcast across the globe, and the Chinese military turned on its own people, and nearly, we estimate, more than 2,000 people were killed. That was a day I'll never forget. It was a night of immense horror and uncertainty. And we didn't know if China would actually last. But it's this freedom, this notion of self-determination that really gave rise to quite an amazing decade that I lived through in Asia. And it all began on this stage for me. I'm truly grateful to the amount of confidence Blake gave me. What Blake taught me, in some ways, was very arrogant. And in some ways, was really the underpinning of almost everything that I did. We were clearly always told and always understood that Blake was the very best education you could get. Certainly in the state of Minnesota, it didn't get better. We were better than everyone else, even if our football team lost time after time after time. And that kind of level of confidence was really instilled in me at a very young young age here in 6th grade when I last stood on the stage. Some of you might remember Bob Close and the vocabulary tests that he would give us. So our language would be deep and broad. Mr. B, with his twisted spine, humped over face, who would stare at you from the top of his glasses and want to know why you had not memorized every river in the state of America. And then Chief Watson, the football coach, who loved to smoke his pipe. And one time I remember him saying to me, you know, pipe smoking really improves your diction. You should smoke a pipe when you're older. So it was from these roots that I went to this world of Asia that I arrived in 1984, which suddenly exploded into this kind of cacophony of democracy. And I didn't really understand it as much as I had wanted to. When I first set out and lived for a year in Nepal, which is probably the poorest country on the face of the earth, one of the things I realized was that poverty wasn't sad everywhere. Poverty was not sad everywhere. Poor people were happy. We weren't all sad. This was the antithesis of what I was taught at Wright. But it was still that independence and the roots of freedom that gave these people motivation to drive their economies. And thank God globalization came along for them. Without Walmart, none of this would have boomed like it did. It's pretty interesting to note some of the aspects about Asia. And here's some statistics for you. Asia takes up 8.7% of the surface of the earth, 30% of the land. %60 of the population of the world lives on this 30% of land. There are 48 countries. It has the world's largest GDP. The largest economies today of Asia are China, Japan, India, South Korea, and Indonesia. 4 of those are in the top 5 globally. Only one other economy is bigger than any of these, and that is that of the United States. The towns and the centers of Hong Kong and Singapore, Tokyo, Seoul, Shanghai, and now Mumbai, Bombay, all take in 70% of international firms. 70% of international firms all have offices in these cities. There are 3.3 new millionaires in Asia. Millionaire being defined as somebody who has paid off their home and has $1 million in the bank. By comparison, there are 3.4 million in North America. And of these economies, it's interesting to note that India was the main driver of the world economy from about 1000 BC to 0 BC. China was the largest economy in the world from year 1 to 1850. In 1850, China accounted for 60% of world trade. In 1850. In 1850, the British Empire came along and changed all of that, and that lasted from 1850 to 1890, at which point the United States became the largest economy in the world. That lasted until 1987. In 1987, 2 years after James Baker had organized the revaluation of the yen, Japan became the largest economy in the world. Remember the stories about Japan Incorporated? It was going to take over the world. They had bought the empire. State building, literally they owned the empire. And then what happened? They had a major economic collapse in 1991. And Japan fell off the charts. And today, the United States is yet again the largest economy in the world. So the reality is, Asia was the future. Most clearly, in any way in which you look at this continent. It is an amazing amount of energy and economic might and power, but it is driven by one thing only: the American consumer. 380 million Americans still drive every one of these economies, and they are export economies. Not one of these economies has its own domestic internal structure to be able to survive. Without the United States, these economies would fall. And let's just review that for a moment. Over the past 30 years, the GDP growth rate across most of the three original domestic democratic economies, Japan, Malaysia, and India, averaged between 5.5 and 6.5% growth for the last 30 years. The rest of Asia lingered until 1986, when this democracy ran over the continent, and suddenly every country on that map, with the exception of this lingering Vietnam, French Indochina, wars and struggles, saw 10% growth a year. The average growth in China for the past 30 years has been 11% a year. That's huge. So how can you say then that Asia was the future? Clearly, Asia's got to be the future. Clearly, everything that goes on inside Asia is about growth. And they haven't even begun to tap their domestic markets. Most American corporations these days are all trying to figure out their China strategies, because not one of them has made money in China. Not one has made a real profit in China. The Chinese currency, the renminbi, the yuan, is still not convertible. It is still not a currency which you can walk into a bank and change openly between other currencies of the globe. It is controlled by the state. Yet, the American fascination with China is undisputed. Look what Coke has done, or Pepsi, or the race between them, or McDonald's, or KFC. Kentucky Fried Chicken is the greatest success story in the People's Republic of China, but it still hasn't made a profit. So, is the future really in Asia? Well, I moved to New York last year after 30 years in Hong Kong, and now I live across the street from New York Stock Exchange, in the bastion of capitalism, the canyons of Wall Street. The street that I live on is called Broad Street. It was built by the Dutch in 1617. Around the corner, George Washington gave his inaugural address, becoming a reluctant first president of the United States. And down the street the other way, a tavern that he liked to drink with his buddies in still stands. At one point, the land that I walk on around my neighborhood was the most valuable real estate in the world, and it was displaced actually by Tokyo while I was in Asia. In the time that I've been gone, I almost feel completely like China has become more like the US, and the US has become more like China. In fact, I would even argue that America's banks these days are state-run. They might not be state-owned, but they certainly have a regulator sitting next to everybody in them and are being run by our government. So, I have clearly made a choice to come home. And I think that that choice is a very clear one, based upon my perceptions of what went on in my life for 30 years in Asia. A few weeks before I decided to move back home, I went to visit a plant, a General Electric plant in Schenectady, New York. They were manufacturing battery packs that were kind of like this, and they would sell them and distribute them to Kenya or to India, where the power grid wouldn't stay on the whole time. So when the power grid went down, the batteries would kick on, the technology would stay on, the power grid came back on, recharged batteries. The factory in Schenectady was making these batteries, shipping them all over the world from beginning to end. And how many people were on the factory line assembling these batteries at the GE plant? Take a guess. Two on their iPods monitoring all of the robots. I bought a house in Mississippi because I didn't want to spend the winters in Minnesota after I brought my Filipino housekeepers with me to America. I thought that they were going to die in the frozen tundra of the Greater Lakes area. So I conveniently moved down south on the river to a place that was much warmer. And one day I went to go fill up my car with gasoline. And the gasoline was $1.46 a gallon. I was like, wow, that was weeks. The price of gasoline has gone down so much here in, lower Mississippi, Louisiana. Yeah. We have the cheapest energy in the world. Regardless of the politics that goes on with OPEC, we have the most amazing amount and most abundant amount of resources to drive the lowest energy costs that we can go. Now pair that with your robots that are making everything. Low energy, robotics, and what do they call it? The reindustrialization of America. I left the reindustrialization of Asia to come back to the reindustrialization of America. And I believe it is real. And I believe it's going to last for a long time. And I believe that there are certain reasons for that, despite the fact that the Federal Reserve will no longer tell us what the M3 money supply is. If it's moved from $4 trillion to $25 trillion in notes that the Fed has spread all across the world, it's still going to grow. And it's going to boom for these precise reasons, I believe, that the myth of Asia being our future is. And just briefly, and I'm going to wrap up my comments here quickly and open it to questions, I want to give you this notion. Asia and Asians identify themselves collectively, not individualistically. Because of the lack of individualism in Asia, there is a deep and cultural lack of innovation. All you need to do is look at the number of patents that are being awarded every year and where they are coming from. The lack of a stable government. Well, in 1989, in that June 4th, when the man stood in front of the tank, he turned around democracy in Asia. Democracy was turned around in Burma. Democracy was turned around in Thailand. Thailand had 7 coups in the 90s. Democracy has been relatively unsteady in Indonesia, but Indonesia is a pretty strong place. Malaysia still remains quite strong. The Philippines has hung on to democracy, but at a risk of a lot of turmoil. South Korea is doing well. Taiwan is now almost completely subsumed into China. And China is going through one of the most amazing witch hunts at the moment that you have probably ever seen. The anti-corruption campaign that began in 2012 has gone to a point where finger pointing and witch burning is taking place almost every day. There have been more than 99 CEOs and senior executives of China who have been jailed in the last 6 months. The corruption campaign is not really about corruption, in my view. It is about your loyalty to the Communist Party and whether or not you remain loyal to the Communist Party. So the lack of this kind of stable government, we might think that the United States doesn't have a stable government, but it really does. We don't have coups here. We don't have, dictators that issue edicts that tell us what we must do. And with that stable government and that democracy comes a responsibility of power. And it is only through that power that you can remain stable. The United States has 10 aircraft carriers. China has 1 and aspires to build 3. India has 2 aircraft carriers. They'll probably have to decommission 1 in the next 3 years. Japan is forbidden to have any aircraft carriers. If you place that power together with a stable democratic government, you create an environment in which innovation can thrive. And it is only based upon this notion of freedom that we feel and know, just like being told at play that you're the very best. The United States of America is the best country on the face of the planet. And there is no disputing that. Because you know you feel that you are the best, and you hold that sense of confidence, you can go out into the world and create products. You can create economies. You can create sustainability. You can create social programs. You can do anything you want to do when you know you can. And because you simply know you can, we do. And I'll maintain one other thing, that the source of that freedom in this country is its immense diversity. And without the diversity of people from every single country in the world, we wouldn't have the sustainability. And it is that diversity that drives our creativity. So what happens to the United States? It is the center of innovation and capital. And what more do we need to drive the world economy? So, I've come home. I've come home, and I'm delighted to be back. Thank you.
My guess is there's a few questions for John out there at a time. Why don't you start us off?
Sure. I was a very junior reporter on a secret mission for the Wall Street Journal, who was trying to uncover the story behind the manufacturing of heroin for distribution in Southeast Asia as a means to fund the Mujahideen fighting against the Russians in 1984. And Osama bin Laden was on the Mujahideen U.S. team. And he wasn't the commander by any means, and he also wasn't the focal point of the story. But he was involved like a shadow. And he's a tall guy, he's 6'5", and he was very quiet, and very pulled back, but he was very determined that he was going to rid Afghanistan of the Russians. That answers your question.
You talked about different changes. What about global warming and climate refugees and how that impacts innovation?
Well, that was another push factor for me to leave. As you know, and many of you know, this is the kind of eastern seaboard of China is where all the manufacturing takes place. So I thought kind of about visiting some pandas out here in the forest and going up here into the kind of the Tibetan area. And I thought, it's going to be really beautiful and the air is going to be really clear and I'm going to have a really nice time. Oh my God. I got there and the smog was so thick in the middle of China. I couldn't literally see 20 feet in front of me. And I thought, what manufacturing is there here? It's just coal. It's all this coal burning. They burn everything with coal. They keep their homes with coal. And it's gotten so bad, the pollution index in China, I don't think anybody wants to live there anymore. If you actually go, here's an interesting story. I won't take too long, but all the wealthy Chinese are moving to the United States. Did you know that? All of the wealthy Chinese are leaving China as fast as they can. I even was at a dinner party a few months ago, and I was asked, can you help me get my children to school in the United States? And I said, why? And she said, well, because my 6-year-old can't get into a boarding school because it's not legal to start boarding in America until 7 or 8. So we put together in Oakland a home of 6-year-olds, each from a different family, and we're rotating a mom through every 2 months. And we're sending those, 6-year-olds to the local Oakland school, which is not great. It's not very good, but at least they're there, at least they're getting that education, at least we can keep that. And then, oh, by the way, I'm buying 2 containers to fill them up with food to ship back to Dad, who's running a factory in China, because he's running a compound of American products at his home, because he doesn't know what plastics are in the food they serve in China, whether he's going to be poisoned or die. He can't trust the pork. It's been filled with cyanide. They don't want any food from locally made anything. But as long as they're making money at the factory, they'll continue to kind of live there and export their children and their money. And because the U.S. immigration laws are so weird, if you have $500,000, you can invest in the United States and you get a green card. Boom, boom, bang, boom, you're an American citizen. Do you know how many millions? 3.3 millionaires are going to come to the United States to live. It's huge. Try buying property in New York or San Francisco. That's all like Hong Kong Chinese. That was all the people from Hong Kong who fled prior to 1997 handover when the Communist Party took back China from British administration. Does that answer your question?
Eventually, these are essentially export economies. 380 million American citizens across the planet. Does the equation change if and when they develop their own business?
Sure, that's what they need to do. 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 When did Japan last have a domestic economy? No, but I'm using this as an example. If this is the economic miracle of our time, and it was, and it still hasn't created a domestic economy of its own, it's now the greatest debtor nation in the world. Do you think this is going to happen over here? Or here? China bought up all the world's resources in the last 5 years. It owns every single mine or oil field or everything it can get its hands on in Africa. But do they have a domestic economy? 38% of China still lives in abject poverty. 40% of your country is still in abject poverty. I don't believe it, at least not in my lifetime. And if China is just a repeat of itself over and over and over again, I mean, look, it was an empire with a king, right, an emperor. And the communists took over, the nationalists took over, the communists took over, and now it's run as one big communist party, one country, for which the last premier amassed for himself $3 billion for him and his family. He owns a company called Anbang Insurance Company. He just bought the Waldorf Astoria hotel in New York for $2 billion.
You see a trend towards onshoring manufacturing people who doesn't have
I think this notion of globalization just is not going to change. We're still so interrelated in everything, in the banking system, everything. It's all interconnected and all interrelated. You can't unwind all of that. But what I do think is that the very high-end manufacturing is going to move back onshore in the United States. The things that can be done with robots. I mean, right now, so Nike went to Korea through my professor at Joseph Bell College to manufacture shoes. Cheap labor, labor strife, move it into Vietnam, move it into China. So now they're here, they get a lot of publicity about child labor, they go through all of this, bad PR, and they emerge, and they hand it over, subcontracted to the Koreans who run the plants, so that they can distance themselves from the issues. And the Nike plants being run by Koreans, which aren't called Nike, they're called something else, are now moving to Cambodia. And Cambodia is a hot market. They manufacture things very well. Their quality is excellent and they're cheap. How long can we keep moving labor around the world? other interesting thing is the purchase of land. Where on this map can you go and buy a house? Well, you're not a citizen of these. Unless you're a citizen of these countries, only two places, Hong Kong and Singapore, which are the biggest money laundering centers in Asia. The reason they thrive is because of all the corruption going on in China and all of the money that's being poured into the casinos that are there. Did you know that you can open an account at Sands Casino in Macau, put several $1 million into your big wheeler dealer Macau account, play around in Macau, make money, lose a little money, get on a plane and fly to Las Vegas and open the same account? And actually, you can take all your money out at the Sands in Las Vegas and then go buy a house in California. You just washed all of your karma. It's amazing.
So democratization, it's kind of
Thailand is just this, it's the saddest separation between government and people going. They just sort of have this, if you've been to Thailand, you know what sabai means, it's just kind of, oh well, the economy is driven still by manufacturing plants from Japan. And their people go through daily life without much strife. But their government really is not moving them forward, so their infrastructure is chaotic and crowded and dysfunctional. And so that just means that, Thailand will continue to have this, protest democracy. It's like Hong Kong has protest democracy. Hong Kong is just kind of finished when it comes to democratic front as well, in my view. But it doesn't seem, on a small scale, to matter. Singapore, Hong Kong, Thailand are all relatively small countries. It's really China and Japan. Yes, Mark.
I found most striking what you said about the state control of American banks versus the Chinese banks. When we read about China, we think it's autocracy. You have your connection, you line them, and you make a lot of money. And so you describe the witch hunt in China, where the state is trying to stay ahead. And I think now in America, because that put me in the head, that description of this bank being run by the state, we see huge settlements every day, UBS, Merrill Lynch, whatever, and it seems to me now that the state, whatever we call it, is seeing the financial industry as a revenue generator. It helps balance the budget they find. So, is it a kleptocracy here because individuals aren't being prosecuted in general? It's the thing. They just pay their money, they don't admit guilt, and everybody moves on. The coffers of our state are filled up.
I'm not sure what the question is there. The question is,
Could you speak to whether there really is that similarity given
Sure.
the paradigm?
Yeah, sure. So when the state runs a corporation, in this case a financial institution, they are the ones managing and dictating what goes on. That's precisely what goes on inside American big banks. And it's run by all of the watchdogs. And whether or not they make a profit is not their concern. And actually, if you take a look at, Citigroup stock. Since the stock price collapsed following 2007 crash, 2008 crash, it has been at $5 and $5.40 that entire time. It's like this line kind of goes like this. There's no growth or profitability whatsoever that any investor can get a return on. China's the same way. But the state actually physically owns the bank, although they've all done IPOs, so a portion of their shares is available to be traded. But the state is dictating what that bank will do. And part of propping up an economy to make it look better than it really is to constantly be collecting all of the bad debts and pretending that they don't exist and making them go away. And that's what's going on in China. So I think it's different. It's kind of comparing apples and oranges, but at the base root, you still have government and government officials telling you what's going to go on with your financial system. And I think that for America, that's the most dangerous thing going on. That will be the one thing that will collapse us back into being like Japan if we allow our government officials to tell us how we're going to manage ourselves.
John, let me ask one last question, and that is, we read in the Wall Street Journal and others about the huge middle class in China that will become its own consumer class and sustain it. You talk about 40% abject poverty, the government class, 3.3 million millionaires, but there's about 1 billion people in the middle that I've been led to believe are going to be a huge consumer force and force to get. You kind of said that's not what you explained.
Oh no, I think that's what most people are betting on. I mean, I think that's what most corporations in the United States are hoping for, because they need that kind of growth to come from somewhere, but it's not happening. And this is my whole point. Why isn't it happening? And the reason to me that it's not happening is because there is no freedom, there is no innovation, there is no stable government, there is no diversity. These are the underpinnings of what makes a middle class work, right? And in China, it's take the land from the middle class, steal it, build 40, 60 high-rises, leave them empty, and take the profits from all of that into your own pockets, go to the Macau casino, put it into an account, fly over to visit Las Vegas, and open your new life in the United States.
So it's
not. So where's the money going? Before we used to talk about transference of technology from the U.S. to China. That was like, why are we going over there to help them do all of these things? That's what I used to think. And it's an interesting strategy. And all of the money poured into China. I mean, everything was made in China. And now it's just all coming back.